The concierge looked at me embarrassed as my platinum card got declined for the third time. My husband smirked, thinking he'd won. But what he didn't know, I had built an empire of my own, offshore, untraceable, unstoppable. This isn't just a story about betrayal. This is what happens when a woman becomes the storm they never saw coming. The morning my father's will was read, I stood quietly inside the library of Whitestone Manor. Sunlight spilled in through velvet drapes, casting golden threads across the mahogany floor. I could hear the tick of the antique grandfather clock behind me, slow and heavy, each second echoing in the silence like a warning. My Uncle Lawrence sat by the window. His hands were folded, his legs crossed, and he was wearing my father's watch, the one I thought I'd inherit, a symbol perhaps of everything else he had taken. He smiled, like this was a performance he'd rehearsed. I know this must be difficult, he said softly, pretending to care. But I assure you your father's wishes were followed to the letter. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I knew this moment was necessary. Let the show play out. The attorney stood at the head of the table, a pale man with a thin voice and thick glasses. He unfolded the document slowly, as though the drama required pacing. The last will and testament of Charles Whitestone, he began, adjusting his glasses, duly updated and notarized 3 weeks before his passing. 3 weeks. That was during the time they wouldn't let me see him. Claimed he needed rest. Lawrence had shut me out of my own father's final days. The estate, including Whitestone Manor, the investment portfolio, and controlling shares in Whitestone Energy, are to be transferred in full to Mr. Lawrence Whitestone. I didn't speak. I didn't flinch. The attorney continued, listing off assets, accounts, properties, all going to Lawrence, all supposedly my father's final wishes. And then, almost as an afterthought, to his daughter Madison Whitestone, a personal trust in the amount of $100,000. $100,000 from a billion-dollar empire. Lawrence sighed and gave me that patronizing look only men who think they've won can master. Still a very generous gift, he said. I looked at him, held his gaze. Then I smiled. You're right, I said calmly. It is generous, just not in the way you think. Because what Lawrence didn't know, what none of them in that room knew, was that I didn't need the inheritance. I already owned more than half the companies Lawrence thought he'd just acquired. And the will he had forged. It was about to unravel, but I had learned patience. I had spent years preparing for this moment. You see, I knew the rules of their game. I just never intended to play by them. 15 years earlier, I was the quiet daughter, the one who attended charity galas in polite silence, the one they assumed was naive, sentimental, delicate, raised in a house where men ruled with portfolios and women were told to smile. But I had watched my father build the empire brick by brick. I knew every acquisition, every merger, every off-the-books negotiation. I had memorized the scent of boardrooms and learned how power moved through silence, not noise. And I had watched my Uncle Lawrence too. The way he lingered in shadows, planting seeds of doubt, always positioning himself just outside the spotlight. He was a parasite, polished, charming, dangerous. I had no illusions about him. I knew that the day my father fell, Lawrence would strike. The only question was when. So I prepared. Not with lawyers or contracts. Not at first. I prepared with knowledge. While they thought I was studying art history in Florence, I was completing a dual degree in international finance and corporate law under my mother's maiden name. While they assumed I was backpacking through Europe, I was meeting with fund managers in Zurich, opening offshore trusts in Liechtenstein, and learning the anatomy of global wealth. By my 27th birthday, I had established 3 international holding companies, each independent, each clean, each untraceably tied back to me through a series of nominee directors and layered jurisdictions. I owned properties in 5 countries, held gold reserves in private Swiss vaults, and had invested in emerging tech companies before they hit public radar. All of it legal, all of it hidden, and all of it built for one reason: to be ready for the day Whitestone name was used against me. When my father was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, I flew home immediately. He was thinner, grayer, but his eyes were sharp. He pulled me aside one night, away from the staff, away from Lawrence, and handed me a plain envelope. "In case they try anything," he said. "This is the original trust. I never changed it." Inside was a document notarized 5 years ago, stating clearly that I, Madison Whitestone, was to inherit full control of the estate. "But I can't prove this if I die alone," he warned. "They'll come for it. You know they will." I nodded. I knew. So I made a copy, and I made sure it was archived in a jurisdiction no American court could touch. 3 weeks later, I wasn't allowed to see him. Lawrence said he was resting, said I would only upset him. He was dying and they locked me. I called every day. I sent letters. They never reached him. And then he was gone, buried with no ceremony, no farewell. Just a sealed will and a family meeting, scheduled for exactly 9 days later. The forged document was slick, professionally done, but not perfect. Because in the corner of every page, faintly embossed, was a watermark that didn't match the paper manufacturer used by my father's law firm. A tiny detail, but enough. Enough for forensic analysis, enough to invalidate the whole document. I hadn't planned to expose it yet, but when Lawrence wore that watch, my father's watch, to the reading, something in me snapped. This wasn't just a theft, it was a desecration. So I left Whitestone Manor with nothing but my phone, my briefcase, and the drive to finish what I started. I called Zurich, activated the document drop. I called my attorneys, told them to begin proceedings, and I called the board of Whitestone Energy, where thanks to my silent acquisitions through offshore channels, I held 52% of voting shares. By sunset, Lawrence's name had been removed from every executive privilege list. By midnight, I had replaced 3 board members and halted a pending merger he was orchestrating with insider benefits. And by dawn, a judge had granted me a private injunction to freeze all transfers from the estate. Lawrence, for all his schemes, had never understood that the real power wasn't in the will. It was in what you build when no one is watching. The morning after the injunction was granted, I walked back into Whitestone Tower, not as the grieving daughter, but as the majority shareholder. Security didn't recognize me. New guards, hired by Lawrence just weeks ago, trained to smile politely while barring anyone not on his list. But this time, I wasn't asking permission. I handed them a folder, notarized documents proving I now controlled the voting rights of over half the board. The expressions on their faces changed as the legal weight settled in. "Notify Mr. Whitestone," I said. "Tell him the real heir has arrived." I stepped into the executive elevator, the one that required a thumbprint and a retina scan, both of which I had already arranged through my silent control of the company's security contracts. By the time I reached the 48th floor, Lawrence was waiting. He stood at the glass wall behind my father's old desk, pretending to be calm, but his eyes told the truth. He hadn't expected me to move this quickly. "You made your point," he said, folding his arms, "but this tantrum will cost you." I walked to the bar, poured a glass of water, and sat down across from him, slowly, like I had all the time in the world. "This isn't a tantrum," I replied. "This is correction. You're not the heir. You're just the mistake I let happen." He scoffed. "You think you can outplay me? Do you have any idea how much leverage I have in this town?" I smiled. apparently less than you thought. Effective immediately, you're suspended from all company operations pending investigation. Investigation? I nodded. For fraud, will forgery, wire manipulation, and obstruction of estate execution. His jaw tightened. I leaned forward, placed a leather folder on the table, and slid it across. That's a preliminary forensic report. Independent. Verifiable. It details the differences between the forged will and the original copy, the one Dad signed 5 years ago, which I had preserved and witnessed. Your version. It was printed on French cotton stock. Dad's firm only uses American linen blend. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew it was over. But I wasn't finished. There's more, I said. I traced your transfers, the ones you made just before Dad's health took a turn. Large sums moved into an offshore entity in your name, unreported. That alone is enough for the IRS to take notice. I stood. You tried to erase me with ink and arrogance. You thought power came from proximity, from being in the room when the will was read. But power doesn't come from presence. It comes from preparation. He lunged forward then, trying to flip the table in some theatrical display of rage. But the security system, now under my control, had already recorded everything. By the time he stormed out, 2 federal agents were waiting in the lobby. They weren't there to arrest him yet, just to talk. But the message was clear. This empire would no longer tolerate thieves in tailored suits. Later that afternoon, I convened the board. The directors looked tired, nervous. They had all watched this family eat itself alive from behind glass walls and quarterly reports. I stood at the head of the table, the seat my father once occupied. I won't pretend I'm here to be anyone's daughter, I began. I'm here because I earned this, not with inheritance, but with strategy. They listened. Not just because they had to, but because for the first time, they saw someone who understood both legacy and leverage. I laid out the restructuring plan, 10 divisions, each to be reviewed, every conflict of interest severed, every shadow contract terminated. I replaced the chief counsel with a woman who once helped dismantle the offshore empire of a South American dictator. I brought in a compliance officer from The Hague. I rehired the assistant my uncle fired for asking too many questions, and I sent a message across every corridor of Whitestone. This house is under new leadership. Privately that night, I sat in my father's study. The room hadn't changed. His scent still lingered, leather and ink and the faint trace of cigars he only smoked after major deals. I opened his old ledger, the one he never let anyone touch. Inside was a letter, handwritten, dated 2 days before his death. Maddie, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened, and I'm sorry. I let him get too close. I trusted him, even when your mother warned me. But I also trusted you. I saw what you were building, quietly, brilliantly. I didn't ask questions because I knew the answers would be more than I was ready to hear. You are not the girl they thought you were. You never were. You're a Whitestone. But more importantly, you're a Rodriguez. Your mother's fire runs in you, and I thank God for that. Take it back. Burn the rot. Build something better. Dad, tears came then, not out of grief, but from the weight of finally being seen. He had known, all along. He had seen everything. The next day, I moved my office to the top floor. Not my uncle's office, my own. Clean walls, clear views, and a single frame above my desk. The original trust deed with my name at the top. I renamed the holding company. No longer Whitestone and Company. It became Rodriguez Whitestone International. I restored the balance. I made the calls. I recovered what was stolen, not just from me, but from the future. And when I stood on that balcony overlooking the city, the wind in my hair and my father's voice still in my heart, I realized something simple and profound. Control is not taken. It is built. In silence, in shadows, over years. The loudest man in the room usually holds the least power. Real power is quiet, patient, and when it rises, it doesn't ask permission. It declares. The first court date was set for Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp in New York Surrogate's Court. By then the media had picked up the story. Heiress challenges late father's will in billion-dollar estate battle. Headlines crafted by people who had no idea what this was really about. They painted me as the disgruntled daughter, the spoiled socialite turned courtroom rebel. I didn't respond. I let them believe whatever they needed to, because public perception means nothing until the evidence speaks. Inside the courtroom, Lawrence wore a navy suit too tight at the collar, his hair combed back like he was going on television, not standing trial. He still thought this was salvageable, still believed he could spin it. He sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his legal team, 3 men from one of Manhattan's most aggressive white-collar firms, expensive, theatrical, and used to winning by intimidation. Across from him sat me, alone technically, but behind me were silent weapons, a forensic handwriting expert, a cybersecurity analyst, a private investigator with 30 years of document fraud experience, and Margaret Sinclair, my attorney, calm, lethal, and patient, the kind of woman who sharpened her strategy with every arrogant interruption from the other side. When the judge entered, the room shifted. It wasn't a trial yet, just a hearing, a question of validity. Was the will genuine? Lawrence's team opened confidently. They presented their version of events like a screenplay, a loving brother, a concerned advisor, a responsible estate executor. They called my accusations grief-induced misunderstandings and baseless fabrications. They talked for 26 minutes uninterrupted. And when they were done, Margaret stood up and said just 5 words. We request permission to present. The judge nodded. Margaret motioned to the screen behind us. Lights dimmed. A projector flickered on. What followed was a surgical dissection. Side-by-side scans of the forged will and the original. Watermarks. Signature inconsistency. Time-stamped printer metadata traced to Lawrence's office assistant's laptop. A recorded phone call, legally obtained, in which Lawrence casually told an associate, "Don't worry, she doesn't even know which lawyer her dad used." The old man's mind was going anyway. Then the clincher, a sworn affidavit from my father's longtime attorney, who had notarized the original will years before, and confirmed under oath that no changes were made afterward. You could hear a pin drop in that courtroom. Lawrence's attorney tried to object, but it was clear. The forgery was dead in the water. The judge recessed for 20 minutes. When he returned, he didn't need long. This court finds sufficient evidence to declare the 2021 document invalid. The previously executed 2016 will shall be reinstated as the operative testamentary document. All assets are to be returned under the direction of Madison Whitestone, sole executor and beneficiary. Lawrence's jaw didn't drop. It clenched, tight, pale, still calculating. He leaned over to his lawyer, whispered something, probably thinking he could appeal. He couldn't. The evidence was bulletproof. I turned to Margaret. File for restitution, I said. Everything he touched. I want it audited. She nodded. But even then, it wasn't about the money. It was about principle. Because for the first time, someone like Lawrence had to sit in silence while the system corrected a theft he thought he could get away with. I left the courthouse without speaking to reporters. I didn't need to explain. Facts had spoken. The empire was back under my control. But I wasn't going to run it the way my father had, or my uncle tried to. That week, I flew to London, then to Zurich, then Singapore. I met with our legacy partners and presented the new strategy. Transparent governance. Women in executive leadership, sustainability embedded into every portfolio. And then I did something unheard of in my family's history. I opened the books. For the first time in 60 years, Whitestone operations, would undergo a full internal audit and ethical review. 3 executives resigned before the ink dried. 2 more were removed. And in their place, I appointed women and men who had once been overlooked, silenced, or buried in mid-tier roles because they didn't fit the old power structure. I found brilliance in unexpected corners. A financial analyst from Ghana who tripled our returns in 6 months. A supply chain expert from Vietnam who cut costs by 40% without firing a single employee. A Latina coder from Brooklyn who built our first internal cybersecurity AI from scratch. The company began to change, not in noise, but in direction. Investors noticed, clients noticed, and slowly even the skeptics noticed. The headlines started shifting from courtroom to boardroom. How Madison Whitestone rebuilt a broken legacy. I didn't do press tours. I didn't write a book. I just kept building, because that's what real power does. It doesn't scream. It doesn't pose. It quietly transforms everything it touches. Back in New York, Lawrence sold his penthouse, moved to Connecticut. He never faced jail time. The DA offered a plea deal in exchange for cooperation on a larger investigation involving estate fraud networks. He's not welcome in the city, and I don't think he even tries. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not pushing harder, if I should have made an example of him. But the truth is, I already did, not by locking him up, but by outliving his shadow, by showing that the daughter he tried to erase became the one who carried the legacy forward, not in his image, but in my own. And when I walk through the halls of Whitestone HQ today, I don't see ghosts. I see possibilities. I see the women who come to work in heels and hijabs and sneakers, all sitting at the same tables. I see decision-making rooms where no voice is talked over, no idea ignored. I see fathers taking paternity leave and sons raised by men who respect women in boardrooms and bedrooms alike. And I see something else too. The girl I used to be, quiet, calculating, watching. She smiles at me sometimes, from elevator reflections, from old photographs in the archives, as if to say, "You did it." And I nod back, because I did, not by being loud, not by being angry, but by being ready, by turning silence into strategy, by understanding that power doesn't come from being feared. It comes from being undeniable. The first time I walked into the Whitestone Family Foundation, after reclaiming the estate, I found a place frozen in time. Gold plaques on the walls, black and white portraits of men in suits, staring down like wardens of tradition. The foundation had been my father's pride, at least in public, a vehicle for tax positioning, charitable write-offs, and polished press releases. But behind the scenes, it was more of a museum than a mission. The funding priorities were outdated, the impact metrics non-existent. The grants flowed into institutions that already had billions, while schools in the Bronx went without textbooks. I stood in that grand marble lobby and realized this was the final piece of the old empire that needed to fall. So I stripped it down to the studs. I dissolved the original board, retired the legacy trustee, and I hired a new team, led by a queer black woman from Detroit, who had built educational programs in underserved communities without a single dollar from our foundation. Together we rewrote the charter. No more anonymous grants, no more black tie galas, no more performative charity. From now on, every dollar would be trackable. Every recipient required to pass one test. Are you building something that outlives you? That became our mission. Legacy through impact, not through headlines, not through art galleries, nor named after men who never stepped foot in them, but through systems that would keep giving long after we were gone. We funded mental health programs for formerly incarcerated mothers. We built coding labs in rural Mississippi. We created a venture arm that gave zero-interest startup capital to underfunded women founders. No strings,
no equity, just belief. And for the first time, Whitestone meant something beyond marble and money. It meant transformation. I received letters from young women who said they never thought someone like me existed. Someone who looked polished, spoke softly, but wielded power like a blade. They asked how I did it. I told them the truth. It wasn't revenge that built my strength. It was discipline. Discipline to learn when no one was teaching me. Discipline to study what others ignored. Discipline to remain silent until my silence became strategy. Lawrence used his time, his money, his name to control. I used mine to prepare. And that's the difference between arrogance and power. Arrogance thinks it can never lose. Power plans for every possible way to win. Months passed, then years. The company tripled in value. Our portfolio expanded across renewable energy, AI, biotech, and ethical manufacturing. We had become not just a powerhouse, but a proof that a woman who had everything stolen could take it back, not just with legal teams and trust documents, but with vision, the kind of vision that outgrows revenge and instead chooses legacy. But legacy doesn't mean comfort. It means responsibility. It means knowing that the decisions you make echo in people's lives long after the cameras are gone. It means showing up even when no one thanks you. And so I did. I showed up, boardroom after boardroom, flight after flight, deal after deal, not to build a kingdom, but to rebuild the blueprint, so that the next girl, the one watching quietly, the one underestimated, the one they say doesn't belong, walks in already knowing she does. People still ask why I never went on television, never gave that one big interview. And the answer is simple. You don't need a microphone when your results speak louder than your history. My legacy won't be carved in stone. It will live in balance sheets that tell stories of fairness, in employment policies that respect life outside the office, in every investment that made the world a little smarter, a little safer, a little more just. That's what I rebuilt. Not a company, not a foundation, not a family name. I rebuilt trust in myself, in what I could do, in the woman I became. The girl they tried to erase, she became the architect of everything they now call progress. And she didn't need applause, just space, just time, just one moment to show them what silence looks like when it finally speaks. It was raining the day I returned to the estate. Not the office, not the boardroom, but the house, Whitestone Manor, the place where it all began, where I once tiptoed around marble floors, afraid of saying too much, where I learned how to stay quiet, how to be invisible, how to let men speak, while I studied the structure of their power. Now it belonged to me, not because of a signature or a court ruling, but because I had earned it. I walked through the halls slowly. The storm outside pressed against the windows, like old memories, trying to claw their way in. The fireplace was cold, the study untouched, and in the center of the great room, the portrait, my father's, still hanging above the mantel, still proud, still powerful, but it didn't intimidate me anymore. It reminded me of what was built, what was protected, what was lost. I stood there for a long time, not as the girl who grew up here, not even as the woman who conquered it, but as something new, as someone whole. My father wasn't perfect, but he gave me what no one else could, a front row seat to how power works, and a warning for what happens when it's misused. Lawrence gave me something too. He gave me the push, the betrayal, the lie that sharpened everything I had ever prepared for. Without him, I might have waited another decade to rise. Without him, I might have kept hiding behind silence. Instead, I became undeniable. I made my way up the staircase, the same one I used to sit on, listening to conversations I wasn't meant to hear. And when I reached the top, I found what I came for, the locked vault in my father's private study. It hadn't been opened in years, not even during the court battle. No one knew it was still active, but I did, and I had the code, 7749, my mother's birthday. Inside were files, letters, stock certificates, deeds from generations ago, and a single envelope, sealed in wax, addressed to me, my full name, Madison Isadora Whitestone. Inside only 4 words, build it your way. No instructions, no control, just freedom. And in that moment I understood the final piece. Legacy isn't something you receive, it's something you design, deliberately, quietly, with conviction. I left the letter on the desk, closed the vault, and walked back out into the storm. The air smelled like rain, and soil and second chances. And I knew then, I wasn't just the heir to a fortune. I was the founder of a future. The Whitestone name had been a symbol of power. Now it would become a symbol of possibility. Not because I carried it, but because I changed what it meant. From that day forward, the foundation bore a new name. Not mine, not his, but hers. The Isadora Fund, a tribute to the woman who taught me resilience. My mother, the woman who raised me when my father was building empires, and my uncle was plotting takeovers. The woman who told me, at age 9, the world won't hand you power, so build your own. And I did, brick by silent brick, stone by hidden stone, until one day the storm came, and I didn't flinch, because I had built myself waterproof. Now when people say my name, they don't whisper it in shock. They say it with weight, not because I fought back, but because I rose above, and I kept rising. I didn't destroy my enemies. I outgrew them. I didn't prove myself to the world. I proved myself to me, because when everything was stripped away, the wealth, the name, the comfort, what remained was strategy, strength, and soul. That's what built the new legacy. That's what made it unstoppable. And if you remember nothing else from this story, remember this. You are not what they tried to take from you. You are what you choose to reclaim. So build in silence, move in wisdom, rise in truth, and when the time comes to speak, let your life do the talking.